if God sent this angelic Agincourt bowman down to save us, well, it's obvious. You've got the white cavalry of Bethune, Triple Entente forces were trying to retreat. Beautiful blonde men on white horses came galloping in and seemed to be completely and utterly immune to the gunshots. The chap who wrote about that, the intelligence officer who wrote about that, is also linked to the Angel of Mons. You just get lost in it. Just get lost, because you can find some really fancy thing. Beginning of 1914, there was about 145 spiritualist societies. By 1919, that number had more than doubled. But that's not the weirdness I'm actually alluding to with this one. This is a personal weirdness, hence a personal tale. And on the back it said, Dad, 1916 or 1917 from memory. My dad's like, well, I don't know who it is. I don't know who it is, because I don't believe we had any relatives as soldiers in World War I. So history, even if they've never had anything military come through, it always seems to happen when I'm there. I don't know, but it's not changed my outlook. It's made me very grateful that he's trusting me. Believer in things happen when they're supposed to happen. I think it's the right time.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? You know, what brought you on your journey to where you are today?
Do you know what? I don't really know. Do you know what? It's one of those things. It's just kind of opportunities present themselves, and you either take it or you don't, is the way I look at it. So sort of saying about, I've always had an interest in the spooky stuff. Always thought, growing up in the village I grew up in, weird things would happen on a frequent basis. I grew up in a little village in Norfolk. If anyone is into Formula One motor racing, the village I grew up in is where Lotus used to be based, the sports, the Formula One cars, Lotus. So yes, I used to see people like Nigel Mansell and Ayrton Senna and all those kind of people in the village. And the next village along, which is about a mile and a half away, is where Lotus Sports Cars was based, at Hethel. So and as I got older, I realised the history of the area I lived in was very, 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 very US Air Force. World War II, US Air Force, with Ketchingham was where the 2nd Air Division's headquarters were based. You've got Hethel, there was an airfield, there's airfields dotted everywhere. So I started to realise that as I got a bit older, but I'd always sort of felt that something was weird. And I do actually talk about a lot of that in my new book, Becoming Peggy, which I just happen to have here. So that's almost, it's not quite autobiographical, because I don't say, I was born on the 26th of July, blah, blah, blah. But it's got things that are more about me than just a location in general. And I do talk about some of the weird stuff that happened to me in my house that I live in, and some of the stuff I found out about the house subsequently. And so there's history and paranormal in there. Like with all my books, it's always a combination of the two, and maybe just a smidge of sarcasm as I'm talking in there. I think the nicest compliment people have had is once they've heard me speak and then they read the book, they say they read it in my voice. They can actually tell where my sarcasm is coming in, which is a massive compliment, I think. And the history side, well, as a kid, my parents would take me to, and as a parent myself, now I understand this, take me to every single free castle that they could find when we were on holiday, so that my sister and I would run around like lunatics and tire ourselves out. But it probably wasn't until I was about 12 or 13 that I started to develop a love for history. And that was down to a teacher of mine called Phil Hancock, he wasn't your stereotypical teacher in that he was a bit kind of out there. Don't know if you see a similarity. He was a bit out there, but he also was more than happy if after a lesson I would say, right, you know what you said about that? I'm not quite sure I agree, and this is why. And he would love that, because most of the kids didn't want to talk about history after the class had finished. And he sort of encouraged me to actually question things and actually look deeper, and not to necessarily take what the established narrative was for stuff. And it sort of started there, really. And And it probably wasn't until, I mean, the story I tell people is that even though I was always interested in this, I didn't really start pursuing it, for want of a better word, until I must have been, I think I was late 30s. And anyone who's had children knows that night feeds take a long time. And you kind of have to find something to do while the baby's feeding because they take ages. And I was just flicking through the television and I found this show and there was all these people with like gadgets and flashy lights and things. And I was thinking, I didn't know you could ghost hunt with flashy lights. And it was actually the Tennessee Wraith Chasers. It was Ghost Asylum. And it was watching that. And I remember saying to my husband, saying, I want to do ghost hunting. And he said, do it then. And it kind of went from there. And then sort of a year after starting doing that, I did a couple of lives to Facebook for the group, and they were like, you should be doing this properly. You should be presenting. And that's kind of, yeah, sorry, yes, Ghost Asylum, Christian. Don't judge. Please don't judge. It wasn't Ghost Adventures. Just remember that. But it was the fact that it sort of was that enough of a trigger to get me into it. And then I just started presenting, and then I got offered the chance to do you want to do a podcast? Your choice, do what you want. And that's where Haunted Histories came in, sort of nearly 10 years ago now. And it all really went from there. What you see now is the product of, let's say, about the last 12 years, really, of sort of writing and meeting people and people encouraging me to write a book. It was Richard Estep who got me to write my first book. People like Paul Stevenson and Andy Saw of Haunted Magazine sort of gave me opportunities, and getting to know more people who've given me more opportunities. And that's kind of why I'm here, really, in a nutshell.
We never forget the people who helped to put us where we are, do we?
No.
And I'm always very, very grateful for people who's given me a chance at writing. So 7 books. Wow. I've got 7 half written. I do need to actually concentrate on finishing them. 1 is almost finished. I've got 2 more stories to put into there and then it's done. And I did hope that I would have it all done by Parameet to sell the books, but it's not working that way with other things that come along. But what's next for Penny, Personality of the Year? What's next?
Well, I've just started working on book number 7. So I'm not sure. I mean, that's probably a good 2 years away, because there's a lot of work I need to do at research, because I'm looking at two places. One's in America and one's in the UK. So there's an awful lot of research to do. Probably just more of the same. I mean, I am having conversations with a very well-known Gothic PhD that most of you probably know. We've got sort of a filming idea that we're talking about doing, so that's probably going to be the next thing. But it's just more of the same. And just I mean, my goal is to get people to my biggest compliment I get when I do anything like this or talk at a Paracon or whatever it is for someone to come up to me and say, do you know what, I hated history at school. You've made it interesting. That to me, and when they turn around to me and say, I hate history, but I'm going to look up that thing that you mentioned because that's actually quite interesting. That's my goal. That is my goal, for people to realise that sometimes the way you're taught it at school, history is everywhere. History is everything. Everything. I mean, what I said 5 minutes ago is now technically history. So it's not just a case of like learning figures wrote, like in 1832 such and such happened. It's real, and if you can sort of see it and almost visualize it and taste it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I tend to say to people is when they say, oh, but history's boring. And I'm like, do you like horror films? Yeah. Well, I could give you more horrific stuff that happened in history than you could ever see on television, ever. And when you start giving them examples, and you've just got to find what someone's, not trigger, it's not the right word, but what incentivizes them to look into it a bit more. And that to me is what I love to do, is to get people to go, I never knew that. And then they might find, they're not going to be a historian in general, but they might find a specific piece of history that they're like, wow, I want to learn more about that. That's really interesting. And that's what I want to do. But I also do think the paranormal world and the history world should be linked. They shouldn't be seeing each other as almost enemies at times, because I've had some really interesting conversations with sort of some big name TV historians about this. And they, have had to say, well, I don't know about ghosts, but actually what you're saying makes a good point. And it's about stop bashing each other and actually kind of work together a bit more, cross over. I mean, the worst thing is that means I get the worst of both worlds. I get the bitchiness of the history world and the nastiness of the paranormal world, and I'm in both. But it also means you can cross the two over quite a bit and get some really, really interesting sort of observations from different people.
Yeah, you're absolutely categorically right. You cannot present paranormal research without having to delve into the history, and you can't just do it bit meal, can you? You have to kind of take it as a whole and get the whole history, and then supply that information to maybe understand what it is that's going on. So yes, I totally agree with you. But yeah, delving into history and research helps you to find things. And not only that, but this will bring us lovely into your talk today. It helps us to find things that we don't necessarily know about our own family. Isn't that right?
Very much so. I like that segue there, Caroline. Very classy.
I have done this for a while. So, Penny, is there anything that you've got talk-wise that's, available that you can slot into that little scenario maybe today? Could we find out?
That could well be my talk, and 5 Came Home might fit quite neatly. We see a couple of people on the side, but if those I can see can... Brilliant. Thanks, Christian. Brilliant. So... before I go on, I noticed Christian had put a little thing in about Ghost Asylum, about how they used to try and catch ghosts in fish tanks and everything else. I have actually chatted to Brannan, who was the one who used to devise those experiments, and he knows that some of them were a bit laughable, shall we say, but it was the MO of the show. So he kind of had to come up with new ones every single time. But it's some of the stuff, when you actually talk to him off the record, some of the stuff that wouldn't have made for glamorous television is actually quite interesting. Some of his sort of physics theories and everything else. But unfortunately, the producers didn't think it would make good telly, which is part of the problem with paranormal telly. I mean, some of the stories I've found when I've done Help haven't made it through because it's not telly, but they're interesting stories. So it's just one of those things. So it's all down to production, I think, at the end of the day. But it got me to where I am here. So we've got to, I guess you could, I'm thankful for it. I don't know about anyone else, but watching that show got me to where I am. So my talk today, and this is a new talk that I've just written, but it's not a new subject that I've been working on. So, if there's anything you think would go well, if I slotted it into it, please do let me know, because I'm always happy to model my talks to make them even better than they are. Originally, I was going to call this talk, War is Weird. That was going to be my original working title for this talk, because I do think war is weird. It's one of those things. If you're looking at just the historical aspect of it, the amount of evolution of military gadgets, of everything else that happens when we're at war, no matter what the war is amazing. And the speed at which things can evolve is amazing. But that's not the weirdness I'm actually alluding to with this one. This is a personal weirdness, hence a personal tale. And it will all become clear as I keep talking. But to start off with, what's so weird? What is so weird? Let's face it, some of the stories you hear from wartime stuff they're hard to believe. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning about when people say to me about horror films and everything. Well, I can guarantee I can find you stuff in history that is more horrific than what a TV producer could dream up. I mean, I'm not talking about Art the Clown in The Terrifier. Some of the stuff he does is pretty gnarly, and even I wouldn't have thought of some of it. But a lot of it has happened before in some way, shape, or form. So when I say that war is weird, I'm really not being dismissive of the sacrifices that brave men and women make when they fight for their country. In no way, shape, or form am I trying to be dismissive of that. But it does seem to be that especially the 2 world wars last century had some very, very paranormal stuff. attached to them. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different paranormal things that are attached to World War One and World War Two. I'm focusing on World War One here, but there is some very, very strange stuff. I mean, I've written about a lot of these weird things for Haunted Magazine. That's kind of where I started my Haunted Magazine, Not So Horrible Histories thing on. It was more on a military slant, like talking about some of the things that happened. So, you know, we're talking about things like the August 1914 Angel of Mom, which is meant to have been an archer from Agincourt, is meant to have held the Germans back so the British could escape. And anyone who knows about that story will know it's actually attributed to Arthur Machen, I think his name's pronounced, and he had written a story called The Bowman. Now, there's still arguments that no, it really did happen. God intervened and God sent this angelic archer from Agincourt to fight back the nasty Hun, so that the true people who were being represented by God could achieve something special. And there's supposed to be accounts of it happening. Funnily enough, nobody can ever find these. They're all second or third hand accounts. My friend told me that they saw this, or I read somewhere that this was seen. There was obviously nobody survives from 1914, but it's one of those. It's been told over and over again, and it's got a very, very theological side to it. In that there was this whole sort of let's make people at home believe that God is on our side, and therefore, if God sent this angelic Agincourt bowman down to save us, well, it's obvious he must be. You've got things like, it's very similar to that. 4 years later, towards the end of the war, you've got the White Cavalry of Bethune, where some of the forces were trying to retreat. The Allies were the Triple Entente forces were trying to retreat. They couldn't get out, and then all of a sudden, these beautiful blonde men on white horses came galloping in and seemed to be completely and utterly immune to the gunshots and the bombs and everything, the missiles that the Germans were launching at them, and scared the Germans so much that the Germans just surrendered. They had the power. They were had the power. They had the dominance. But this white cavalry scared them so much. Now, interestingly enough, the chap who wrote about that, the intelligence officer who wrote about that, is also linked to the Angel of Mon. So is there something in it? A chap by the name of Cecil Whitewick, he's linked to both. Who knows? Maybe it was divine intervention. Then you have sort of other stories, like things like horrific ones, that were supposedly the crucifixion of the Canadian soldier. Supposedly a Canadian soldier was found crucified with German bayonets on the side of a barn. You have all those kind of things that are horrific, but also almost slightly sort of weird and spooky in nature. And then you can go to the individual stories. It's very easy to find the story of the mother. And these are stories that have been recounted. Mother seeing her son, who should have been in France, walk into her front room and start talking to her, then disappear. And then 5 minutes later, the door knock with the telegram saying he's been killed happens. These stories are very, very easy to find, and a lot of them are told firsthand. So is it because of war that this sort of paranormal activity ramps up? Or is it because people are just so desperate they're manifesting it? I don't know. You can look at things like the spiritualist movement. Now, I'm not that knowledgeable on the spiritualist movement. In fact, I actually spoke to Dr. Kate Sherrill about this earlier today, just to double check a few things with her, because she is the queen when it comes to that. But when you look at the figures at the beginning of 1914, there was about 145 spiritualist societies. By 1919, that number had more than doubled. Now, was this because people were trying to contact their loved ones, or was it because they were getting experiences and they wanted to quantify those experiences? We don't know. And you can look at things like the SPR. The SPR had a massive focus on paranormal experiences during World War One. Why was this? What was going on that made them think they had to focus on it that much? Now, a quick cursory glance of the newspapers, and it's very easy to find. I found loads of different stories. I've only picked out 3 for you for the purposes of this presentation, but these were written at the time. So this first one, it was featured in the Whitby Gazette on the 28th of January, 1916. So it's kind of 6 months before the Somme. started on the 1st of July, although technically the bombardment of the Somme started towards the end of June, but we won't worry too much about historical semantics here. But it was before the Somme. So, and it's talking about Belgium being the most haunted battlefield, or one of the most haunted places in Europe. It's the battlefield of Europe at this point, because you've obviously got Ypres, or Wipers, as it was known as by the British, all going on there. There were people dying every day. Every day they were dying, even when there wasn't supposed to be technically a battle, there were people dying. And this story talks about two soldiers who, there was two soldiers, and then a third soldier saw someone who he thought was his mother, and she got in the way of these other two soldiers, so they couldn't do anything. And he identified that, he said, it's my mother, it's my mother. And by getting in the way, she actually stopped them getting further injured. Some of the forces were trying to retreat. The Allies, which were the Triple Entente forces, were trying to retreat. They couldn't get out, and then all of a sudden, these beautiful blonde men on white horses came galloping in and seemed to be completely and utterly immune to the gunshots and the bombs and everything, the missiles that the Germans were launching at them, and scared the Germans so much that the Germans just surrendered. They had the power. They were had the power. They had the dominance. But this white cavalry scared them so much. Now, interestingly enough, the chap who wrote about that, the intelligence officer who wrote about that, is also linked to the Angel of Mont. So is Lancashire Evening Post on the 5th of April, 1916. And this talks about a soldier who was kind of a little bit annoyed that this nun had come to talk to him and told him that, well, her actual words were that until the nations sank on their knees and pleaded with God for mercy, there would be no end to the war. Now, he was a bit annoyed, this Irish guard. He was a bit annoyed that this woman had put herself in jeopardy. And he actually did go, and he went to the convent to speak to the Reverend Mother and asked, why are you sending one of your nuns here? It's a little bit dangerous, don't you think? And the nun turned round and sort of said that was our former Reverend Mother. She died. The woman you just described to me was our Reverend Mother. She died. Now, this Irish guard was meant to be quite a sort of upstanding and not prone to bits of weirdness, shall we say? But he identified her. So, had she visited him? Had she basically said, "You've got to stop. Until you stop, people are going to keep dying. You've got to plead for mercy." Or was it a story again told about the whole theological side and trying to believe that if we prayed hard enough, which is actually one of the things that people were told to do, was to pray, and that would stop the war. The third one, hopefully you can all see it, was sorry, got an itchy nose. I'm so sorry. This was in a Lancastrian newspaper called the Nelson Leader, and this was on the 11th of January. And this poor family, their sons were missing. They had two sons who were missing on the front. Nobody knew who they were. Now, there's an awful lot of missing soldiers on the front. A lot of them, some of them are even still being discovered now. It's not something, and if anyone wants to know afterwards, I can explain why bodies are still being discovered now. But they believed that they could see their sons when they pulled the blinds down in their house. They said whenever they pulled the blinds down, they could see their sons. And even the police apparently looked into it, but it was kind of fobbed off. They were told they were imagining things, and it was dismissed, even though they swore they could see their son. I think his name was Walter. Whenever they closed their curtains, when they pulled their blinds down, they could see him. Now, he was missing. Was he trying to communicate with them? We don't know, because nobody would actually investigate it. Nobody would look into it. But with so much paranormal stuff, even now, it was just dismissed, even though there was quite a flurry of interest when this case was first discussed. It was dismissed by the powers that be. They were seen to be a bit crazy, and they were just grieving their lost sons. But with so many things, I just think, how do we know? We don't know that. Maybe the sons were trying to communicate with them. Maybe they were trying to say something, but society wasn't ready to accept it. Now, is that fair? Well, I'm not sure if I think it's fair because, there was quite a lot of famous people who were interested in the paranormal at this time in every way. You had the famous writer Rudyard Kipling. Now, his son John had died in Luce in 1915, and he was Rudyard, was very, very negative about the whole mediumistic thing, about communicating with the dead. He wrote a poem, Endor, which kind of was warning people off it and saying, it's not good. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically it was not good. And a lot of that was attributed to the fact that back in the 19th century, he had actually met Madame Blavatsky, and he thought she was a great big con artist. And a lot of people think that's why he was so anti anything to do with mediumistic and psychic abilities. So you had him on one hand, who's kind of very down on it and dismissive of it. And then on the other hand, you have another literary name, one Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, who was a public spiritualist, came out, I believe it was during the First World War, he came out and said, no, I actually believe in all this. I'm fascinated by it. I think it's real. And he was promoting it. Now, his son did actually die, Kingsley. He did actually die. Now, he didn't actually die during the war. He died after the end of the war, but they believe it's due to injuries he sustained in the Somme, caused him to contract pneumonia in 1918. So it was attributed to a war injuries, but he believed in it. Then you can go even one step further. You've all have heard of Sir Oliver Lodge, the physicist, who actually believed he was communicating, and I'm not saying whether he was or he wasn't, with his son Raymond. Now, did he? I don't know. Nobody really knows, do we? But you've got these people who are quite learned, and it's the two sides. People either seem to be very, very into the whole spiritualist thing or very, very anti the spiritualist thing. And I find that fascinating as to why. Why would one person, Kipling, be warning people off wanting to go and see a medium to try and communicate with their loved one? And then you've got the other side, and still men actually saying, no, actually, there's something in this. We need to look into it more. That's interesting to me. And it kind of brings me on to my personal story. So, for years, I'd been told we had no family members who fought in World War One. I don't know about you guys, but when I was younger at school, and when we did anything to do with the wars, the first thing the teacher would say is, do you have any family members who fought? Do you know of any family members who fought in World War One or World War Two, depending on which one we were studying? And I knew I had family members who'd been involved in World War Two. Both my grandfathers had been. And like dutiful little schoolgirl, I toddled off home and like, Mum, Dad, did we have anyone involved in World War One? And the answer was no. No, we didn't, because all of our relatives were in reserved occupations. They were actually, I was told they were steelworkers up in the northeast. And as a kid, I was like, oh, because all my school sort of colleagues were saying, yeah, my great-grandfather, my great-uncle, this, that. And I'm sitting there going, no, they just worked in steel mills making the metal. Basically, they didn't do anything, because as a kid you think that's exciting, don't you, that they're one of the ones who's gone to the front and been in the Somme and been in Wipers and Passchendaele and all those things. And so my whole life that's what I kind of believed. Now, my dad had a box of photos that he'd inherited from his mum, and every year, from about 17, 18 years old, I'd look through these photos. They were fascinating. They sort of dated back to the 1940s, as far as I knew, these photos. And I would be going through them all the time. And I don't know how many times I've gone through these photos and asked who people were. And it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was Christmas, and I was looking through them again. And I discovered the photo. I don't know if it's on the left of your screen, but the one on the left with a soldier and his bride. The bride's sitting down, if you can all see it, and there's a soldier standing next to her. And I turned around to my dad and I said, who's this? And he's like, I don't know, it's probably a friend of your Nan's. And I said, well, Nan was born in 1920. That's a World War One soldier. So I doubt he was a friend of hers, because she was born in 1920. And the question then came back from my dad is, how do you know that's a World War I soldier? And I said, well, they didn't start using khaki until, well, it was about 1901 they started using khaki. So the First World War was the first war really that they dressed them in khaki. I said, the other thing as well, you probably can't see it on the screen, but on his legs, he's got puttees on his legs, but the bandage type, not the sort of buckle type that they used in World War II. And I said, I know as a historian, they didn't use puttees from about mid-1930s. I believe it was 1938 they stopped officially using them. So that is a World War I soldier. Once I looked into it more, I could tell from some of the badges and everything, it was a World War I soldier. And so that was the first sort of thing that kind of piqued my interest. Then I discovered these two photos. And by enlarging the face of the soldier in the hat, I realised it was the same man who, if you look on the top one, is the lower down of the two beds. And also, if you look on the bottom one, it's the chap holding a baby. It's the same man. And I was explaining this to my dad. It's the same man. It is the same man. Then doing a bit more research, obviously these are in black and white, but I found out that in World War I, if you were in hospital, the uniform was a dark blue jacket with a white lapel. So this was someone who was in a military hospital, who was being treated as a military casualty. So anyone who knows me knows that research is something that I quite enjoy doing. I quite enjoy disappearing into the archive. So between me and my dad, we started researching. And we actually found out that this man was my great-grandfather. He was my dad's dad. My dad never knew this. He knew he had his grandfather's name was Donald, and Donald lived in Loftus, near sort of Middlesbrough. But he never knew that, there's more, by the way, he never knew that he'd fought in World War I. It had never been mentioned. So we also had a clue that not only had he fought in World War I, he'd been injured. So we used those records to start trying to work out who he was. Well, Donald was born to Francis and Bradshaw in York on the 12th of June, 1896. He had 9 siblings. There was 9 of them in total. I think Anne had actually given birth to 11, but only 9 survived. If anyone ever does this kind of family research, the 1911 census can reduce you to tears when you start reading that, when you see how many children the woman has given birth to and then how many are still surviving. It can get quite emotional, and I mean that sincerely. His dad was actually a station master at Alliston Station, which was renamed Eberston in 1903. He had 4 brothers. That's going to be important. He had 4 brothers, and when he left school, he'd been working as a farm labourer. I don't know when he left school. I haven't found his school records, but he left school. But he chose to enlist in the army in 1913. Basically 13 days after his 17th birthday, he chose to enlist. So he enlisted in the army before war broke out. He was quite diddy, and I think this is where I get my lack of leg length from. He was only 5'2" and half an inch, and he had a 33-inch chest. So he's very small, very small. At that point, you were only allowed to join if you were 5'2" and over. So he just made it. He just made it into the army. And he became part of the 5th Yorkshires, also known as the Green Howards. They were actually a territorial force. So they were kind of teased a bit by the big boys, the big army, the British, the BEF and everything else. They didn't see the territorials as actually being anything really worth writing home about. They were wannabes as far as they saw them. He went into training, various different training camps, and then on the 17th of April, 1915, he sailed from Folkestone to Bologna, and he arrived in Bologna on the 18th of April, 1915. Now, up until this point, even though we were involved in the war, it was actually quite hard to get people to volunteer. But on the 16th of December, 1914, Scarborough was attacked from the sea. I don't know if people sort of know the history of the area. Scarborough was attacked from the sea. And whilst when we look at the people who died in air raids in World War II, the number was small. It was 19 people died, but they'd never experienced anything like that. And it galvanized the men of the Northeast to sign up because they were so disgusted at what had happened because there was a lot of women and children suffered. They were so disgusted, they actually had to set up new regiments within the Yorkshires to actually cope with the influx of men wanting to join because of what had happened. So they're probably the place they used to go when they go to the seaside was Scarborough. Basically, these men were dropped in it from the get-go. They didn't have a chance to acclimatise in April 1915. One of the sources, if anyone's interested in researching World War I history, each regiment had to keep a diary. Now, some of these diaries are easier to read than others. I've been reading the 5th's diary and trying to make head nor tail of some of the writing in it, because sometimes, obviously, they'd be writing in a trench under attack with pencil. But it's fascinating to read, and then you have to work on how to work out. So they'll be telling you where they were being stationed, and then it's working out which, cross-referencing it to which battle are we actually talking about. Now, the Yorkshires were thrown into it from the get-go, and they were also thrown into the area where the Germans actually first started using poison gas, which is why I've put this slide up. This isn't my great-grandfather, this is just a slide I found. It's Imperial War Museum slide. The way they treated with gas attacks was rudimentary, but they had something. The French had nothing. They had nothing, and it was their trenches that were being attacked originally. The first gas attack was at the beginning of the Battle of St. Julien on the 22nd of April, and there's actually a diary that's been kept by one Private Stevenson, and he commented that on the 23rd of April, when they were, and he was part of the Yorkshires, when they were travelling to the trenches that they were going to be based at, they saw all these gas victims, Canadians and Scottish men, coming back, all struggling to breathe, looking yellow, coughing, in pain. And nobody had ever experienced that before. It was a completely new thing. And this was all, for those of you who know some of this was the second Battle of Ypres that this was part of. So my great-grandfather was thrown in literally at the deep end. He lands in France, and the first thing he's having to do is go straight into battle, straight into types of warfare that they had never seen before with these gas attacks. May and June, they're moving around constantly. They're going for relief to go to a new trench. And then they ended up in somewhere called Sanctuary Wood, which this is a modern day photo of Sanctuary Wood. You can actually go and visit it. This was where a few years later, it was very, very famous as Hill 62, where a load of Canadian troops died. I think it was between April and August 1916. So it was kind of crossing over into the Somme, but not actually cast as the Somme. And the reason it was known as Sanctuary Wood was because in the early stages of the war, this was where people would escape to get away from the fighting. But by the time my great-grandfather went there, it was in the thick of it. It was in the thick of the fighting by this point. These trenches, I have read up on accounts of how that there was one soldier said in his account that they were posted there to relieve the troops who were there, and they're literally picking their way over bodies that can't be moved, that are rotting, that have managed to find their way out of the shallow graves that they've been placed in. It must have been absolutely horrific, especially as the irony of it being called Sanctuary Wood when it was under attack. And this was actually the first time that my great-grandfather was injured. On the 22nd of June 1915, he suffered a gunshot wound to his hand, and he was taken to Rouen for treatment. So it wasn't severe enough that he had to be given a Blighty pass, as it was called. He had to come back to the UK, but he was shot for the first time. He was injured for the first time and had to go into hospital for treatment, albeit still in France. He rejoined about a month later, back in a similar area. So he's had a month of being treated in hospital. He's straight back on the front lines. 2 months later, he's injured again within 2 months of rejoining the battle. At this point, he's only moved to a field hospital. He's not moved to a main sort of military hospital in France. He's moved to a field hospital, and he comes back again. He's back again within about a month. He's back on the front lines. And I mean, I'm just thinking of the mental turmoil. Twice he's been shot and he's put back in. Twice he's been shot and he's put back in. Reading the war diaries, they talk about there's constant, every day it says, right, which officers have been injured, which officers are missing, which officers have been killed, then which ordinary ranks have been injured, and it's almost like it's so common, there's no emotion attached to it whatsoever, and it makes for very sort of reading. Now, he carried on fighting, and then in the December of 1916, he contracts flu, bad enough that he has to be sent back to the UK. And the irony is, he spent longer in the UK because of flu than he did because of these gunshot wounds. He didn't actually come back to fighting until September of 1917. So he's 9 months recovering from flu. That must have been how unwell he was. But at that point, he's back in the thick of it, because a few months later, another battle, what was called Battle of the Somme, starts. Battle of the Somme wasn't just one battle. It happened 3 or 4 times. That the Somme was the area that they were trying to, and the German offensive was trying to push the Allies back from it, the ground they gained. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about battle strategies, but he was in the thick of it yet again. He was involved in things like there was the Battle of, I can't speak very good French, so I do apologise, the Flers-Courcelette. He would have been involved in the Battle of Morval, the Battle of Transloy. In the Battle of Transloy alone, there was nearly 60,000 casualties for the UK, and that battle was 17 days. So there must have been a constant smell of death. Well, on the 27th of March, his war is over. He's been shot again, and this time it's a very serious leg wound. He gets a Blighty pass, which does mean his war is over. So he gets sent back to Blighty. Now, between the 22nd and 31st of March, the statistics for his regiment, according to their war diary, there was 21 killed, 219 wounded, and 124 missing. That would have been out of a regiment of less than 1,000. So that's a pretty large number were either wounded, missing, or killed as a percentage. It's no wonder they were constantly pulling in reliefs from other, like, regiments that weren't actually supposed to be out there fighting. Like the 2nd, 5th, they weren't supposed to be fighting, but they had to keep pulling them in because they just needed those men, because at the end of the day, it was a war of attrition. Now, he did come back to the UK, and that's when we found those hospital photos, because he spent over a year in hospital trying to treat this leg wound. Over a year. Now, I can't understand. I would have thought they'd have just, sounds awful, chopped his leg off, but apparently they didn't. And I said to my dad, I said, did he ever walk with a limp? And Dad's like, I don't ever remember seeing him walk anywhere. He was always sitting down, so maybe he was still having problems afterwards. But what makes this case, for me, so special? Well, there was 5 of them that ended up fighting. 5 brothers, all went to war. All of them came back. So I have gone from thinking I had no family members who fought in World War I to finding out that I didn't just have 1 or 2, I had 5. And the youngest, you can see there, the little Navy boy, that would have been my great uncle Arthur. Great uncle Arthur, sorry. He was 14 when he enlisted in the Navy. Apparently he'd tried to get into the Howards, the Green Howards, but because they knew his two of his brothers who were also Green Howards, they knew that he was faking his age. A lot of boys did manage to get in and fake their age, but he didn't. And in the end, he was told the only option, if you really want to do this, is to join the Navy. He joined the Navy at 14. 14. He was fighting. Now, it's quite amazing that they all survived, in my view. His brother John was in the Howards with him. His brother Francis was in the 16th West Yorkshires. And I've just started researching the battles they were part of, and they really were in the thick of it. His brother Harold was in the 17th Northumberland Fusiliers, NER Pioneers. They were all involved in some of the very, very well-known battles, and they were all involved on the Western Front. It blows my mind about this. It absolutely blows my mind that I've gone from not knowing any of them to finding out that I've got a very, very big family history. Now, Donald came out of hospital on the 26th of Feb, 1919. I think during his period of having flu is when he got married, and they also created their oldest child, because she was born in 1918. They had their second child, which was my grandmother, Daisy, although she's probably looking down on me and screaming at me for calling her that, because she renamed herself Dorothy, but she's Daisy on there. And he ended up working as a furnaceman. Not uncommon in the Northeast. Steel was a very, very popular industry in there. He died at the age of 59 in 1956. And I asked my dad about him, what can you remember? And he just says his mum never would talk about her dad, and that he was very, very difficult. When you start to think that the guy's been shot 3 times, it's not really a surprise that he's probably got carrying some form of PTSD, I would have said. That obviously back then nobody knew what that was. But not only the fact that these photos didn't show themselves to me for so long, and then when they did, the information about his history has just started coming in. There's also other stuff, which I know some investigators will go, that doesn't mean anything. But about 2 months after I first started discovering all this stuff about my great-grandfather, I was doing an investigation at a place called the Kersal in Southend. And I was kind of helping a group on a Ouija board. I was not touching the board. I was sat off it. I had no influence over the board whatsoever. And they asked it, is there anyone there who wants to talk to us? Yes. Can you spell your name? And he spelled his name was Donald. And I'm thinking, it's interesting. Then they said, were you a soldier? Yes. World War I or WWI. Now, again, that wasn't going to be odd, because the Kersal had, because of, the area of Southend had a very strong military presence. There was an awful lot of military World War I soldiers stationed there. Again, World War I, Donald. Then they said, is there anyone here you want to talk to? And the planchette flew to where I was sitting. I was not touching it. I hadn't spoken. I then said, is that Donald Bradshaw? Yes. Now, maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't, but that was strange. I have subsequently done kind of voice box type work and had his name come through. I have had his regiment said to me on Ovilus before when I've been asking the question. I think he wants me to tell his story. I think he does, because there is that much information coming through. The fact that I had never seen these photos in 30 years, and they'd been in the box. My dad swears they weren't new. Why had I not seen them? Was Donald waiting until he knew that I could actually start finding the information out? He almost waited for me to learn how to do this kind of research so that I could tell his story. I'd be interested to know what you guys think. But that aside, it's taken me nearly 2 years to get to this stage with my research. Obviously, there's a lot more research than I put into the presentation, because you don't want to hear all the dates and the things of all the battles and all the numbers and all of that stuff. I've kind of summarized it for you. But it's taken me nearly 2 years to find this out. And I want to find out similar information from my great-great-uncles as well, so I can tell their story, because what I have been finding more and more is it wasn't uncommon for people to survive. It was uncommon for them to survive without any injuries or trauma to what they dealt with. I have not found any accounts of any soldiers or even the nurses or the drivers or anyone who's come home without some kind of what we would recognise now as trauma. And I think my great-grandfather definitely suffered trauma. Shot 3 times. 3 times. But I found a really good poem that is written, which I'm going to read to you, if you don't mind. And this was written by a female poet in 1916. Since they have died to give us gentleness, and hearts kind with contentment and quiet mirth, let us who live give also happiness, and love that's born of pity to the earth. For I have thought some day they may lie sleeping, forgetting all the weariness and pain, and smile to think their world is in our keeping, and laughter come back to earth again. That's my talk. Thank you ever so much for listening. If anyone wants to check out any of my stuff, my website, hauntedhistories.co.uk, is at the bottom there. And if you've got any questions, I'd love to answer them for you.
Tell the people listening and anybody who'd like to research a little bit more where you find your information and how they can go about trying to look into their own family history.
I mean, the main thing to start with, well, census records are the best place to start to begin with, especially when you've got things like the 1911 one that shows how many children has been born and how many are still alive to someone. Obviously, the census records only go back to 1841. If you need to go back further than that, you do tend to need to go for church records that tend to be held in different archives. And then you've got things like the birth records. It's much easier to look up family history from the 19th century onwards, because one of the things the Victorians were incredibly good at was record keeping. So it does make life a lot easier. A lot of parish records that predate probably I'd say the 17th century, and certainly Henry VIII's reign of destroying everything. Not many of them still exist. So it's a lot harder to find out stuff going back further than that. You do tend to have to look at things like the archive, National Archives and everything else, and get a bit canny on how you find it. But the one issue you have with World War I records is that the archives used to be in London, in the centre of London, and it was bombed during World War II, and a lot of the World War I stuff was destroyed or damaged, what they felt beyond repair. And since World War II, they've been undertaking restoration to try and restore as many of these records as possible, which is why if you go onto like the Ancestry websites, or Forces War Records is another good one for that sort of thing. Just because it's not there now, it might be there in 12 months' time, because they're gradually restoring as much as possible. Or you sometimes get records that have been partially burned, and you can still see bits of them. So those are the kind of places that I start looking. And then, you've got things like the war diaries that were kept by each regiment. And you can access most of those on National Archives. If you've got a membership for the National Archives, you can download them for free to look at them. That's kind of where I start. And then it's literally sort of finding different books that might have something in there that you can, fit into. Newspaper articles is another great one. It's nothing new to find the work out, but it's a case of just persevering and keep digging. And for example, things like one of the records I found for one of my great uncles, they'd spelled his surname wrong. They spelt it, I think it was Bidshaw rather than Bradshaw. So it's almost little things like that. You have to kind of think outside. I hate this saying, think outside the box to start looking for the information. But it's I would say to people, when you're researching, just get lost in it. Just get lost, because you can find some really fancy things.
Rabbit holes.
Get lost.
Yeah. So for those that don't quite know the word and the terminology that Penny's used, so ancestry, you don't have to, by common misconception, you don't have to do the DNA test that is recommended. You can go in and it's free, but you're limited to the access that you can get. If you can get a deal that's offering you 6 months at a discounted rate, if you're serious about your research, I would suggest getting a membership and pay monthly for that. Family Tree is one that is exactly the same. It works on Ancestry. They give you a little bit more information free than Ancestry does, that they give you free. But personally, if you're interested in researching your family in depth, I would go for Ancestry, and I would go for, depending where your family, if they're only in UK, go for UK. But if you think you've got European or Irish connections, you would probably need the worldwide. That's the difference.
I mean, the other thing as well is I've used Find My Past as well, and they do have slightly different specialities. So Ancestry, if you're looking for stuff on workhouses and asylums, they tend to store at that on there. Plus Ancestry also has an arrangement with Forces War Records for some of the military stuff. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is most libraries have access to these systems. Most libraries will have access to them for free, and archives, like your local archives, will definitely have them for free. So if you know you're going, and one of the things I found, I mean, I'm going to sound really arrogant, I don't ask the archives for help, but when I've been in the archives working, I've heard people asking the archivists for help navigating like census records and everything.
Yeah.
Well, no, census records on Ancestry or Find My Past or whatever, because they don't know how to search for things and they don't know what they need to look for. And there are tricks to finding them. So if it is something you're totally new to, if you've got a local archives, they're brilliant. But most libraries will have access to those systems as well for you if you want to go in and research there, because you don't want to, you've got one project you want to do. I do pay for a full-blown membership because I'm using it constantly.
But I just wanted to throw a question out there, is that, are you expecting your interactions with Donald to change now?
They've got stronger. I never knew he existed until now. Well, until obviously a few years ago, and I started researching him. And he does seem to, if I'm doing an investigation, his name comes up a lot more than it ever did before. So I do feel that I'm getting to know him, if that makes sense. That he's. So yes, I do feel it's got stronger, because whether it's the fact that I don't, obviously this is all very sort of, we don't know, we just don't know. But I do wonder if he kind of made it so that I saw those photos and started asking questions when he knew I had the resources to actually follow up on it. I don't know, but the fact that, yeah, my dad didn't know any of this, any of it. And when I've been saying to him, yeah, he was at the Somme? No, he was at the Somme, but not from the 1st of July. It was later on he turned up, because obviously the Somme was 4 months worth of fighting. The fact that, you know, all these famous names like Passchendaele, Wipers, Ypres, Wipers, all of these, he was involved in. And when you start to think of that, it's kind of like, whoa, I was watching a World War I documentary with my husband, and it was just like, that could actually be my great grandfather. That could have been him. And it does make it feel more like he's not just a photo. He's a real human being who had fear, who had dreams, and it makes me sad that, but the thing is, looking at all of them, all 5 of them, well, not only one of them, I think, made it into his 70s. The rest of them all died before they were 60. And I just wonder, is that anything to do with what they went through? Did they were, apart from Arthur, the naval one, they would have always been sort of exposed to gas attacks. Is that something that, you know, and unfortunately, I can't get hold of their post-war medical records to see if they ever went in for recurrent chest infections or something. But it does definitely makes it, like I say, he seems to come through a lot more now, even not necessarily directly to me. I might be with other people and somebody will say, Donald, does that mean anything? Yes.
So has that changed your personal view then about what you think the other side might be? If you're now having a stronger connection to someone who maybe is reaching across time, who may be reaching across the veil, how is this, because I know you're a very grounded researcher. So how has that shifted your perspective? And then potentially there's someone who is related to you who's now talking to you from somewhere. Does that change your spiritual perspective, or your perspective on what the paranormal might be?
Does it sound wrong to say no? I know it hasn't. I'm very much a believer in things happen when they're supposed to happen. So I think it's the right time. That's why. I mean, one of the conversations I've had with other sort of paranormal investigators is, we don't know. They say, if there is a spirit world, right? If there is one, are they seeing everything in the same timing that we are, or are we very slow to them? Are they very fast to? And maybe that sort of 100 years where he died in, it was 56, I think. That might have only been like that to him, to where I am now. He might have been literally waiting for the person who could, because of the fact that I've always had an interest in military history. This isn't a new interest. One of my nicknames when I've gone on investigations is the military magnet, because if I go somewhere that's got a military history, even if they've never had anything military come through, it always seems to happen when I'm there. And is it that he knows that if he shows me things, I'm going to kind of understand what I'm looking at? I can put the pieces together because I've got that interest in military history. I don't know, but it's not changed my outlook. It's made me very grateful that he's trusting me with this, and I'm also pleased that I've been able to fill in some gaps in my dad's history for him as well. Yeah. So, but it's not made me look at the paranormal in a different way.
Okay.
If I'm honest.
So I guess